Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome to the main game, what we've been building up to for a day and a half now. Just going to address the small issue of can agriculture save our climate? We're going to have all the answers here today. In preparing for this, I was reflecting on Bob Dylan's 1965 classic song, Subterranean Homesick Blues, in which he sung, "In life, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." And 2 years ago, it was pretty apparent that we had a tailwind in our efforts to make progress on addressing climate change. Governments were making increasingly bold pledges. Companies were making 2050, then 2030 targets. Huge inflows of capital, novel tech and ideas that were going to make a huge difference for us. Even based on a cursory glance of the media in the last 12 months, there's been a distinct change in tone, which Hugh has just alluded to. The US is again leaving the Paris Agreement. I opened the Fin Review on February the 5th, and in one edition read that IKEA was pulling back on its emission targets in Australia. Green funds were seeing record withdrawals from the EU and US. BP had shelved its plans for biofuels plants in Western Australia. And 2 days later, the Age newspaper tallied up to 100 companies that have now quit the federal government's climate action scheme, which they joined to register emissions and offsets in the voluntary market. Now, if the wind hasn't changed direction on this, it's certainly dropped off, and the going is starting to feel harder, and there's a sense of wavering resolve. That makes it all the more important than ever to have the discussion we're going to have right now. What role is ag capable of playing in improving our environment? How can we execute that? And how can we credibly prove what we've done when all is said and done? And therefore make a much needed contribution to saving our climate at such a critical juncture. To help me with this, we have a fantastic panellist panel I'd like to welcome to this stage. Carly Burnham from Bonnie Doon Organic Beef. You come up as I announce, please. Michelle Gorton, CEO of the MacDoc Foundation. Hugh Killen, MD of Impact Australia. And Dr. Susan Orgill, Senior Scientific Advisor with Select Carbon. Please make them feel welcome. Carly, I'd love to start with you because I think we need some good news stories to get us going and show what we are doing, if I can claim the royal we for what you did. You have a 20,000 acre organic beef property and the proud holder of the largest amount of soil carbon units in Australia. Tell us why you got to that point and how.
Well, our soil carbon project journey began in 2016, so we're 9 years into the project, and at year 5 we had our second measurement, and it's a very scientific methodology, a highly verified product. An Australian carbon credit unit is known as the best in the world. And the reason we leaned into this opportunity, we were approached by Dr. Terry McCosker, was to better understand what was actually happening with our soil. We knew anecdotally that we were building carbon, that the whole ecology of our farm, the whole system health was improving. So it was a priority for us to invest in this project, and it has yielded to be very successful. So we've sequestered over 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, which means using livestock, and red meat is our organic beef is our product. So using livestock to pulse graze, utilising the natural system of sunlight and photosynthesis and plants, we've naturally sequestered that carbon deep into our soils, measuring deep to 1.2 metres. So it's been challenging and very rewarding, and it's certainly an opportunity for Australian agriculture and Australian soils. But carbon isn't the only part of solving climate change. Soil carbon has been a byproduct of the natural ecosystem that we operate within, and really nurturing all the dynamic parts of it, even the financial parts, the profitability, biodiversity. There's not one thing that's isolated.
Mm-hmm. For the non-beef producers amongst us, tell us some of the practical things you did that led to that accumulation of soil in the carbon.
Yeah, so the project is registered with the Australian government, the Clean Energy Regulator, and a requirement is practice change management. So we committed to increasing our paddock numbers from 60 to 100, and using time control grazing method to move the cattle through the paddocks to pulse graze the pasture and essentially get rest into the soil and let the natural processes, the microbes and the fungi do what they're best at doing. Nature's been doing this for hundreds of millions of years. So we work with the rhythm of nature in a balance of scientific methods, but also intuition and gut feeling.
Mm. Hugh, you work with evokeAG on with advising businesses on asset management and strategies in a nature positive way. How replicable do you see approaches like Carly's taken? Why aren't we all doing this?
Well, we're trying to prove out that you can do it at an institutional level. And so the way to think about what we do at evokeAG is we take what Carly's doing, which is very innovative, and they would have taken a lot of risk and a lot of time to build that out in their production system. And we're trying to bring in other investors and other capital to crowd around her methodologies and actually scale that out. And so we do that from an institutional level. So we bring capital, not just foreign, but some capital from Australia in, and we put very much the same processes in around our grazing properties that we manage for the same outcomes. So evokeAG Australia, we operate very clearly at that kind of crossroads between highly productive agriculture and the application of the natural capital and the ecosystem services we put across all the farms we manage.
Yep. Carl, I just want to throw back to you a point there about risk. So Hugh says you take some risk here in going down this path. Did it feel like that to you?
It did. We entered this project, like I said, it was for research for the betterment of Australian soils and to understand better what our soil was doing, what's the potential for Australian agriculture. So it was a significant investment, and also in the capital infrastructure. However, we have tripled our productivity through doing this practice change. So it's actually been very beneficial for our business, as well as we have a soil carbon credit, or many of them, and we know what the potential is. And like Hugh's saying, it can be scaled up and scaled down. But essentially, we stuck to our core business of organic red meat and working in this natural system, and really observing deeper and nurturing all the parts, the financial parts, the productivity, our the lowest hanging fruit is our beef herds, and are they as efficient as they can be? Yeah.
Okay. Michelle, before we broaden the aperture and look at broader natural capital, just on the carbon side, the MacDoc Foundation in 2023 launched Atlas Carbon to collaborate with livestock producers to integrate carbon projects into their business. What have you learned from your experiences in that space?
That's not actually correct. Atlas Carbon isn't related to the MacDoc Foundation. It's part of the group. Maybe Hugh, you might want to comment on Atlas Carbon.
Right.
Apologies. I can't really comment on that.
Apologies for the lack of fact checking there. Let's jump then to Susan. Susan, tell us a bit about Select Carbon and the reasons that you're attracted to this space.
Yeah, so my background is applied soil carbon science, and so I've done a lot of research and work with farmers. I'm really passionate about agriculture and have seen this transition from soil carbon being a soil health metric, and now there's a market available, and there was that kind of opportunity for an enabling factor, I think, for producers to adopt some of the practices like Carly has spoken about. But really what it's about is about promotion of soil health and productive and functional landscapes as well. Select Carbon, we're like a carbon service provider, so we work with farmers as do the other companies like Carbon Link, which were just mentioned, and Atlas Carbon. So there's a community of carbon service providers which work with farmers to design projects and implement those practice changes through the evokeAG scheme, which is the federal government scheme.
And what are the greatest barriers you see to replicating what Carly has done on a mass scale through the red meat industry?
I think scientists can be our own worst enemy, to be honest. So I think there's a range of barriers that we can think about. And one thing is uncertainty in the market and where that uncertainty comes from. And that might come from politics and being nervous about changes and expectations around what producers are going to need to do in the future. It might be uncertainties around the permanence of carbon and building that in the system. But I also think the scientific community is exceptionally curious and good at solving problems as well. So I think we're moving more into the curious and less furious science debate in that scene. But
Can I build on that a little bit? I think, and the good job that people like Suze do and Atlas Carbon do as well is actually help farmers approach and understand what soil carbon's all about. And soil carbon can be quite a confusing notion by itself, but ultimately what we're doing is we're drawing down biogenic carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. That increases soil health and soil resilience, and that's a good thing for any farm, and this is what Carly's farm and the farms that we operate prove out. In Australia, we just have to happen beside it a framework under the evokeAG scheme that rewards you to do that. At evokeAG, and I'd expect Carly for sure would be doing the same thing, we'd do it if we weren't getting paid for it anyway. Because ultimately you're creating a more resilient and a more profitable, as we heard here, farm over the longer term. So it makes good business sense. And it makes good environmental sense. And that's how I think about it is the two balance sheets of a farm going forward. One is what's your operating P&L balance sheet that sits in the farm, so your land, the margins and the revenue you make out of your enterprises that are on there. And on the other side, you've got this natural capital balance sheet that's starting to develop now that has such things such as ACCUs or a price on carbon, but now there's biodiversity markets starting to come online. Can get rewarded for environmental plantings, etc. So it's not just soil carbon. So it's kind of the debunking what soil carbon is a little bit. And I think Suze is a great educator. Atlas Carbon's model is to actually go out into farms and educate before you actually go into a soil carbon project and work with the producer about, you know what, you mightn't have the right soil type to be able to do this type of a project. So try and help people through with the highest amount of integrity, because ultimately everything we do around this has to rely on the integrity of what we do, and the claims that we make about our products actually have to be, sacrosanct in many ways.
Very quickly, 3 things, right? I reckon for a soil carbon project to work well, it needs to be integrated into the farm business, right? Designed well, science-based. That's super important. The next thing is soil carbon is important for everyone, farmers and non-farmers, because it provides healthy kind of clean air, food and water. The third thing is the question is not, can the evokeAG scheme save our climate? So the evokeAG scheme is a tool to reward some people for some things, and there's a market there. But around kind of the role of agriculture more broadly, soil carbon is one part of that system. Disclaimer, the most important part, because I'm a soil scientist, but just one, saying it now. It's one really important part, but it's a system, so
Michelle, tell us about what the MacDoc Foundation is doing in this space.
So, and I'll pick up, I think that's a really great segue from Sue into this conversation about the parts of how we answer that question. And I think it's really fortuitous that we followed Hugh's session on this, because the reality is that agriculture can't save the climate unless we're prepared to have a pretty honest conversation about all the sources of emissions and nature destruction and the destruction of health that happens as a result of different types of production systems, different types of actors in the supply chain, and a lack of inaction at policy and at policy level. I mean, I think what we heard from Hugh is the food company, so let's just characterise the food companies and their role in sort of the emissions profile and some of the initiatives that they're clearly putting in place to position agriculture to perform better on a climate metric. I mean, the truth is those companies that were listed in that slide that Hugh presented rely on very large-scale industrial agriculture that is fossil fuel intense, it is fertiliser and agrochemical heavy, it is responsible for huge amounts of land clearing, and it is producing food in the main that is actually superfluous to human health. Most of those foods that are produced are things like, and when we think about our own export profile, we've got things like grains, livestock feed, going offshore to make things like cakes, noodles, you know, things that we actually don't really need to eat. And what's more concerning is the processes that those foods need to go through are also very emissions intensive, right? So we've got this layering on of intensity of carbon emissions through in a part of the agricultural ecosystem that is actually growing. And I think what's sort of also dawning now, and I think this information is now landing in Australia, not only is this food that is being produced with Australian agricultural commodities, which is very emissions intense, superfluous to human health, it is actually now being shown to be harmful. And so I think when we answer these kind of questions, and we always tend to hyper-focus on the kind of work that Carly and other farmers are doing their absolute best to steward nature, to provide food for communities, their families that is nutritious, that is healthful. That is not going to be sufficient if we are also not having honest conversations about all of the other stuff in agriculture that is driving emissions and now that we know is also delivering poor health outcomes. So I think when we answer this question, it's being able to hold a space in which we can have pretty difficult conversations about this and be really able to have them. But to do it in isolation, I think, and focus on what individual farmers can do at great expense to them, at great effort to them, without also honestly looking at those things and thinking about what is it that we're signing up to. If we say that the role of agriculture is to feed the world, we can no longer be agnostic about the kind of food and at what cost to nature and the climate.
Yep. I hark back to those who were with us for the anti-obesity medication discussion. It's not everyone's favourite answer to being more responsible about what we eat. But Jack Bobo from UCLA was highlighting that the adoption of these drugs is so widespread that we could reduce the amount of food that the United States needs to be produced for them by up to 15%. You can see it well, and that's all that stuff that we don't need, or a lot of it. So not really let's all take responsibility, let's just take a drug, but something to watch in terms of could make a difference to this balance.
And can I just give you a data point? So just on the 11th of February this year, the Financial Times published a snapshot of how childhood obesity is tracking around the world in high-income countries. 35 years ago, Australia was tracking anywhere between sort of 10 and 5th in the world in terms of childhood obesity. In 2022, we have moved across both boys and girls to number 2 after the US. Like, we need to start stitching these things together to start thinking about not just solving one wicked problem. And you know, the thing is, food is so central to life. Agriculture sits at the heart of all of these solutions. We know, like, agriculture still produces all the things that would solve for these crises, you know, fruit and vegetables, healthy, nutritious meat and dairy, you know, that's the food that we should be eating. But yet that sector, you know, you've got AusVeg at the moment running a campaign desperately trying to increase a shrinking share of wallet, trying to get people to eat more fruit and veggies. Like, something here is not squaring up.
Yep. Carly, I want to come back to, you have taken an approach which has led to a improvement in the health of your soil, your business. You've accumulated these carbon credits. What are you going to do with them all?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're currently in a discernment process of what we're going to do with the credits, and it has come with great responsibility because we are leading the way in Australia with the project, but also with the credits. So yes, we're still finding our way with that. But I do want to touch on, Michelle evoked something in me. I think we've really lost connection with our food.
Yeah.
And as a culture, and to lose connection with food and where food is grown and created is in nature. You know, farmers, we are reliant on nature to provide our income. And we have, Grant and I have shifted our mindset over recent years from commodity of organic red beef to it's actually food. It's nourishing families, and and we don't always know when it's exported which families it's nourishing, but we do locally. So part of this solution, it's it's huge, but it's actually inspiring and invoking in others to really consciously consider, what am I eating and where is it from and how is it grown? And we have a direct-to-consumer market, and our customers are increasingly aware of that and wanting to know about our practices. Yeah.
Can I just
Please.
expand on this? So the question started around how are you going to monetize an ACCU? So it's a decision around whether you're going to inset that or offset it and sell it to someone else. Central to that decision point will be, I'm guessing for Carly and her family, will be, am I going to get paid a premium for the product I'm selling for the effort of insetting my practices on the farm?
Yep.
That doesn't happen today. We're hoping it's going to get there. We're building systems to get there, but it doesn't happen today. And it's all part of the problem that I think Michelle was setting up at a kind of a very high level, and also your point about our connection with food, right? And so it's a very complicated system. If you think about red meat, if we go back to Pete and where Mick were talking about beef and lamb, for instance, our largest retailers in Australia, their whole primary role in shelf is to delete other people's brands. That's what they do. And that's fine, it makes good business sense to them. I'm sure their shareholders are really happy with that. But they're not, there's no incentive for them to carry Carly's brand on shelf in their supply chains, because they actually want their own brand in there. And so all the stories that's attached to what's been done on these farms, the carbon credits or the ACCUs that are being generated, it doesn't carry through to the consumer. So the consumer's got to start asking questions about where does its food come from, you know, and really stepping into that discussion. That's a very difficult discussion to have with inflation running where it is now and food costs and all that good type of stuff. And so it is very complicated. And I did like those slides that we saw beforehand. Can I talk about hamburgers for 2 secs?
Please.
I'm sure there was a burger joint up there. I won't do the signal, that the symbol, but who I know well, that is actually signing up to a big target around regenerative agriculture. There's nothing wrong with that. If you tie together the fact that they buy a lot of beef, which they turn into mince and then to burgers, that's an interesting part of the problem and the issues that Michelle's been talking about, right? They run advertorial programs globally about knowing who their farmer is. Industrial mince is a product that's bought in bits. It's a chemical equation that's put together, and then they create a burger. I like burgers, by the way, so I'm not against the burger. But there is no possible way that supply chain can have any claim back to its farmers. Zero. And so the whole system has been built against getting to know your product. And so another example I'd use in Australia, and I'm working with a client now around how do we scale their beef brand. It's almost impossible in Australia because there's no kill slots in Australia to process that beef. So I can take the most nutritious, natural beef, it can be ecologically verified, it can have all the attributes that we want, and I just cannot scale that because you can't get the space to do that. It's a systems issue that I'm trying to plant here. We're going right to the food and away from carbon, but the systems design is complicated in terms of making the change that's required from a nutrition perspective, but also the core question around can agriculture save our climate? You know, and we, as farmers, we look after 55% of Australia's landmass. So I'd say we can solve the climate issue, but the whole system's got to be designed to support us to do that.
Yeah, like just Susan for a minute. And then.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I was telling kids, like, what I was coming to Brisbane for, and there was a range of things, and I said this topic, and they're like, so what's the answer? Like, can we? And I was like, hopefully. And then I'm like, regardless, like, we need to do everything now, right? Like, I think we've got this paralysis almost around perfection over progress. And I'm a numbers person, right? And I like to get everything right all the time, but recognizing that it's a living system, and then we've got people and health and soil and landscapes and everything. And like last year, a cool paper came out, which I read it, and I'm like, oh, beauty, finally someone said, and it was hit the headlines in newspapers about kind of soil's going to be the #1, you know, climate bloody emissions and everything because we're going to lose all this soil. I read the paper because, like, I actually read the paper, not just like the title and the abstract and things. I read the paper and I'm like, they were saying, if we do not act right now with practices that we know build soil carbon, we are screwed. Like, they use a really clever academic way to say screwed in the paper. And so I read the paper and I was like, right, here is the evidence. And then everyone's emailing in the media and it's all that we're doomed anyway, so throw your hands in the air, we're just not going to try. I'm like, that is not what the paper said. It said, act now, landscape scale, it won't be perfect. We know the practices, we know that producers know how to do it and want to do it. Like, how do we enable them with those practice changes and motivation to do it?
Yep. Michelle?
So I agree with Susan. I think we need to do all the things, right? So, and I think, and we have to, celebrate, be grateful for the work that people like Carly and the other farmers who are working with you and Sue and others who are doing. But it's not enough. It has to be all the things, and it has to be looking at all the actors who have outsized power in a system that is very high emitting and is delivering a whole range of negative benefits, feeding the world, but at a very high cost. And I think I disagree with Hugh on how comfortable we can be about some of those claims about being regenerative. I think we need to be deeply suspicious of those claims. The world does not need regenerative Doritos. Like, that is not a solution for anything. And that's where that's heading. Chips, soft drinks that are known to be causes of huge numbers of diet-related disease. What do we need them for? They're fun, they're delicious, they're designed to be addictive. We can't go to a shelf and be attracted to some beautiful beef that Carly might be producing because the 4 Ps or 5 Ps or 7 Ps of marketing are deep at work on us. The supermarket shelves are designed in such a way to drive us in particular directions. Food deserts are created to move our food choices. This is what farmers are up against. It's not just defending, can agriculture save our climate? We are dealing with huge forces around what shapes the demand for food. So to the point around the consumer needs to say, they need to be a pretty strong and well-informed consumer because the stuff that's being put to work on them is pretty powerful.
Yeah. So can I ask you, as to really, how much faith, though, do you have in our ability to change that? Because I'm hearing what you say. I'm not questioning it at all, but I'm sure we've all been to the United States or countries like it. The food system is not going to change quick. So I think it's fair enough to call it out and highlight it. It can't just be agriculture. But really, do any of you expect that to change in the next 5 to 10 years much?
Look, I think, can I answer? I might step into it. And I'm noting what Michelle's saying, and we don't need regenerative Doritos, as nice as they might be. But at least there is the start of a commitment.
Yes.
At least there is a start of a commitment, and it's got to start somewhere. So that's. It's easy to be very critical of the whole system, but it needs to start somewhere. I was involved in some work in London the year before last, where I was sitting in the room with the CEOs from the big CPGs making this claim about regenerative agriculture, and it's harder than even the slide that Hugh was showing, because they're making these claims around, or making these commitments, not claims, and they're proper commitments. I mean, if you go and have a look at the Mars Group sustainability documents, it's actually quite compelling, and they're tying significant outcomes, and they're going hard on it. They still sell chocolate, but they're going hard on trying to transition their supply chains. But at its heart, when they commit to regenerative agriculture at the board level, they have no idea around what it is that Carly does or what evokeAG does on the ground, and so there's this huge capability gap. And so we spend a lot of time advising these companies, you're making these claims, well, this is actually what it means. So we quite often get a phone call way too late in the process. And so how we design these systems up is going to be really critical, but at least they're talking about it now.
Yep.
I mean, it's going to take more than 5 years, though, for sure.
Michelle, when we look at what they're targeting in their annual reports and their sustainability reports, do you think there's too much focus on carbon in that? I know you're pretty passionate about.
I think that's right. I think we all know, especially in agriculture, we've got an opportunity to talk across a number of dimensions, and we need to. You can't really talk about emissions in agriculture without talking about nature.
Yep.
Like those, they're just completely interlinked. So I agree with that. And just to pick up on Hugh's point, I agree. And yours, Tim, it is a deeply entrenched system. But I think as consumers, as citizens, we just actually need to be more connected. I think Australia has been a very lucky country, and COVID and the supermarket inquiries have started to show that there are cracks in the system. So that's kind of not really working for people. People don't really know why, but there's something at a level that they know that something's not right. They're forced into a duopoly. There are a whole range of things, and I think improvements, commitments, steps to try to do better is really important and should be encouraged. But I think there are a couple of other things that we need more information about, because we have no transparency around the amount of lobbying dollars that are being moved by food companies and other actors in the system that move to government or to move to industry to maintain the status quo. We have no visibility of that. In the US, there's a lot more transparency around lobbying dollars. We need to see more of that, because the only thing that's going to really start to move the dial on this is conflict-free policy making that is ambitious and bold and that is designed to serve communities, healthy citizens, nature and climate. So until we can address that, we've got a problem. The second area, I think, and research has come up a lot in this conference about the kind of research that we need, like what tools do we need across the entire ecosystem of agriculture and the food system. Again, we need blue sky, big, ambitious, thinking around what flywheels can we put in, like public interest data sets that provide information about natural capital. Like, we've got to stop with this kind of breadcrumbing, right, of solutions. And I think, the Climate Smart Agriculture program, I've reviewed that list of, successful projects. I've reviewed the Future Drought Fund stuff. There's a lot of money going to universities. There's a lot of place-based work. I'm sure there's some really brilliant stuff out there. But is there the stuff that's going to really move the dial? Probably not.
In terms of what moves the dial, you worked in banking for 25 years, head up AACO, have run operations as well. How this gets valued into land? So we talk about incentives for primary producers to do things in this space. Carly's talked about how the incentives are there just for the operational benefit and doing the right thing for many beef producers to make progress on soil carbon and broader custody of the land. But something, and we've also talked that it's hard to see a lot of premiums being offered beyond the farm gate for products coming from these systems. But a pretty big driver for a lot of farmers is the value of their land. How do banks look at agricultural land, businesses like Carly's that have improved the land in terms of valuations? And is that an enabler to action on this or nothing happening here?
Yeah, I'll answer your question in terms of what they're doing now, and then there's some things that are starting to happen that are super interesting, and then where it should be going probably. So any of you that are involved in agriculture or even like valuing a mortgage on your own house, really, when banks will look at a farm, they'll look at the value of the business that sits on the farm, and they'll do a discounted cash flow on it, and that'll come up with a number. And then they'll use another pretty simplistic methodology is what did the next door neighbour's farm sell for, and that helps drive the valuation for that farm. That's pretty much how we do it today. Now, Carly's farm would be, I'm talking about your farm, would be valued, you'd like to think it's valued higher because she's focused on soil health and she's focused on biodiversity, and it will outwardly look like a more healthy operation, and hopefully some of those cash flows they're going to discount will show that. So she should at the margins get a little bit of a higher value, but it's really nothing much more than that in terms of how the banks are looking at it. They are, however, trying to transition how they look at it and look at it differently. And there's been a lot of really good work, philanthropic work done by Farming for the Future, for example, which is actually thinking about what value do we put on, what economic value do we put on a farm for ecosystem services and natural capital. And so it's that piece, that second balance sheet that I was talking about, that we need to bring into the valuation of a farm, because that'll be a driver and a game changer when we go forward. So hopefully the valuation of Carly's farm in the future will have absolutely, they'll do the discounted cash flows, and they'll have to still look over the fence and see what the neighbour sold for, but they'll also be putting a value on the ecosystem services, the natural capital that sit on that farm. And so that is starting to move in that direction, and that's a very good thing. It's very early days, and you were talking yesterday in your session about how do you start thinking about pushing these natural capital valuations into the market so people can run with them, and I think that's an important thing to happen. Now, I've been having some goes at supermarkets and whatnot, and I am a reform banker. Thanks for outing me there. But
call it out.
But there are some banks doing some really cool stuff at the moment. National Australia Bank started a program about 2 weeks ago now with the Clean Energy Finance Commission, where they're taking significant discounts on people's cost of debt. They're actually stepping into projects around natural capital, stepping into projects around sustainability or transition in machinery, and that will actually reduce emissions over time on the farm. So, and that's a really interesting program because it's a discount on your negotiated rate. So it's a proper discount. So, and that's becoming there's probably some NAB people that'll be able to talk about it better than me, but it's like a 1.15% reduction up to $5 million. So banks are starting to think about, well, what are the incentives that we can put in place to help Carly in her transition? If she'd had that back in the day, I'm sure you would have been all over that straight away. And they're using the Clean Energy Finance Commission that's got a big bucket of capital to help get that out there. And so that's the start, I hope, of us being able to look forward in a couple of years and seeing, the valuation around natural capital and programs in place that'll make that work.
Carly, do you see this happening on your place around you? And is it important?
It is important. I think about it's a big system kind of change required, and rather than feeling overwhelmed, I think, well, can I do? What's within my control? And it's a great opportunity for all agriculturalists to explore their values and explore these financial markets and opportunities, or commodity markets, or food system access, and just understand what is actually going to integrate and work best for their business. And I feel like it's slowed, as you said in the opening, Tim. It has slowed. There isn't the rush that there was 2 years ago when we were issued our ACCUs. But I think that's a good thing, because we've got to get a lot of integrity into these markets and integrity into how we're doing agriculture. And I actually think, farmers have the answer. We are very good at what we do, and if we can be clever, our soil carbon project is sort of at the more sophisticated end of the spectrum. But there is so much to gain along the way, and the smallest change in mindset, actually where it begins, the smallest change in mindset is dynamic for one's business, for human health, for livestock health and well-being, and for our food systems. So do what we can in the system that we operate in, and hopefully that will influence. And I don't know which part of the system needs to shift first, but something needs to happen. And I'm inspired by my panellists and so many colleagues in the industry as well that are working hard. It's a grind, but it's coming.
Yep.
Can I so that point that you just made, Carly, about which part of the system needs to shift, I think the whole system needs to shift. Every industry needs to transition, because even though the discussion and the momentum around the C word or sustainability or all of that has slowed, climate waits for no one. Climate change will wait for no one. We'll be on a degrading resource base. That's not going to wait for anybody. So the reality, and farmers know this better than anyone. And so I think the system can help people like Carly by ensuring that her representatives, the grower groups, the NRMs, people who are around to support farmers, continue to provide that scaffolding, continue to provide the support, and genuinely lean into this question of do we need to shift to adapt to a changing climate? So it can't just be people like Carly acting on her own in the headwind.
Yep. Okay. We've covered quite a lot of territory. So big topic, can agriculture save our climate? Carly's certainly leading from the front and showing that actually we can do material things that have direct benefit, measurable, demonstrable, and have credits you're going to be able to do something with in future. We're saying that this is replicable on other operations, so this is something that we can extend and make more contribution to reducing our footprint, if not helping to retract carbon. We're talking about much broader than that we need to look at beyond carbon to a whole natural capital perspective and how important that is. We're talking about it being hard getting premiums for this sort of stuff beyond the direct benefits on farm, but perhaps we'll see some movement around valuation of lands being recognised, the increased value of land being recognised. As we wind up here, 1 minute or less each. We'll start with you, Susan, please, and then move across. What would be the one last message you would like to leave this audience? We have innovators, investors, government, primary producers, the supply chain here. What would be the last message you'd like to leave them with as we look for this quest to make more of a contribution to saving our climate?
Yeah. Don't let carbon fall through the cracks. Absolutely, it's not all about carbon, but carbon is going to be a really important indicator and needs to be a key indicator moving forward. There's a sophisticated market around it. But more than that, it's linked to a whole range of other productivity benefits that we are going to desperately need to feed and clothe our population, but also to maintain all of those ecosystem functions as well. So we have the science and evidence about what we need to do to scale it, and I think we just need to get on and do it.
Okay, thank you.
I'd be saying, I'd just build on the soil carbon piece, which is the way I look at it as soil carbon is an outcome of good agricultural management on your land. And then I'd extend that into asking people to think about the attitudinal economics part of it and starting to think about, in the context of the farm's balance sheet, that operating balance sheet and the natural capital balance sheet and how that comes to drive change.
Okay. Thank you.
I think agriculture is well placed to be the most essential service that we have. We should feel deeply proud of the people that produce our food and fibre every day, and we should do everything that we can as a community, as governments, as representatives, to support them to be successful and to be fit for purpose in a really changing world.
I think about having courageous conversations within our industry and being realistic about the spectrum of the landscape and how it is being nurtured and the productivity. But I also think about having those conversations across industry and sectors and truly collaborating in a new and different way. We actually need something so nuanced and different. And, we have a model, I have a model of my business, which is, very holistic and integrated. And I think it's time that collaboration happened and to really try to, shift and change. And it's really about a cultural change and mindset. It's the paddock between the ears.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's a wonderful note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel of Carly, Michelle, Hugh and Susan for this discussion.
Thank you.